welcome back to the channel. So for this week's video, I wanted to talk about some of Pathfinder 2's weapons. But not just any weapons, specifically those with a monk trait. First is that while there are a number of ancestries with specific weapon traits associated with them, we see elves, dwarves, goblins, kobolds, etc. Monk is the only class in PF2 to have a specifically associated weapon trait with it. The second reason is that a lot of iconic monk weapons have the monk trait. Bow staff, shuriken, and nunchaku obviously all have the monk trait, but some more esoteric weapons are also represented here, including things like the kama, the kushigama, and the tonfa. So I'd like to go through and take a look at what the monk weapons are in PF2 and what options we have available to us to use them. So in terms of ways to use monk weapons effectively, most of the feats, somewhat unsurprisingly, are going to be in the monk class. While there are a couple of archetypes that exist to help with monk weapons, something like Student of Perfection comes to mind. They are meant to be used by and large either in conjunction with or as a sort of replacement to the monk class. So for this video, we're just going to be covering class feats unique to the monk class that help with monk weaponry. There are two main paths a monk can choose when specializing in feats that use weapons as opposed to just their unarmed attacks. The first involves the usage of bows in particular, and the second covers the sort of generic use of any monk weapon in the game. So we're going to start with the bow line of feats, beginning with monastic archer stance. This is a stance which allows you to use long bows, short bows, or bows with the monk trait in place of normal unarmed attacks for your monk features. Things like flurry of blows or feats that require specifically unarmed attacks to work. Now your range increment is halved while you're in the stance, but it is still basically the only way to use bows effectively as a monk. This leads at level 6 to return fire, which also requires deflect arrow as a prereq, and tacks on whenever you use that deflect arrow reaction that you can immediately grab out of the air and take a ranged attack with your bow that you're using. This is somewhat comparable to arrow snatching in level 8 that any monk can have access to, except that arrow snatching specifically calls out that you attack with the projectile, which is a thrown weapon, and return fire uses your bow attack. And you're probably going to be more proficient with bow attacks as a monastic archer than a random monk is as thrown weapons if they're just going to use arrow snatching. Next up we have Focus Shot at level 12, which for a single action allows you to make a ranged strike which ignores concealed and any cover the target may have. And lastly, at level 18, we have Triangle Shot, which allows you to make 3 attacks for 2 actions, applying both Stunning Fist and persistent bleed damage if enough of the arrows hit. Now, while those are all the feats with monastic archer stance as a prereq, I also want to cover pinning fire here at level 8. While it doesn't technically require monastic archer stance, it does require you to make 2 range piercing weapon strikes against the same target with your flurry of blows. That's going to be obviously very easy in monastic archer stance, and there is another feat that I'll cover later that works with pinning fire, which is why this doesn't specifically require either of them as a prereq. As for what pinning fire actually does, it's very comparable to Stunning Fist. It requires both attacks of the flurry of blows to hit, and the target must make a reflex save, but if they do, they are immobilized. Compared to Stunning Fist, where only one attack needs to hit, it's a fortitude save, and they are stunned. It's certainly weaker than that, but it's a free extra effect on top of your fire blows, and the more action denying effects you can stack on an enemy, the better. Next up is the generic weapon feat line that you use if you don't necessarily specifically want to be restricted to bows. Starting with monastic weaponry at level 1, which just gets you access to all monk weapons, gets you trained in all monk weapons, and allows you to use your melee monk weapons in place of unarmed attacks, very similar to how monastic archer stance allows you to use bow attacks in place of unarmed attacks. Next we have ancestral weaponry at level 2, which just gives any ancestry weapons that you have access to that are also agile or finesse the monk trait. So, for example, if you want to use the elven curved blade as your monk weapon, this is the feat that would allow you to do that. Next is shooting star stance, which is just a stance that allows you to use shuriken instead of unarmed attacks as your monk weapon. Fortunately, while this does work with pinning fire, it has basically no other support in the system. And if you want to play a ranged monk, you're probably much better off going with the monastic archer stance instead, which doesn't require the additional feat tax of monastic weaponry to work. Next we have the PF2 stance, which is the second stance which requires monastic weaponry or prereq, and is dedicated to using monk swords specifically. It also has the additional benefit of whenever you hit with a monk sword strike, you get a free step as your next action. This leads on level 10 to P-Foul Strut, which is just an action you can take to step twice and then strike with your P-Foul sword. And finally we have a level 14 Whirling Blade stance, which is our third stance which requires monastic weaponry, but one which gives all melee monk weapons with the finesse trait the thrown 10 feet trait. That doesn't seem so great except for this second paragraph, which allows you to bounce that weapon Captain America style between different enemies so long as they are all within range. At the end of your attacks, the weapon will just fly back to your hand unless it's blocked by a barrier, at which point you can catch it in preparation to use again on your next turn. So now that we've covered all the feats available to the monk class to work with monk weapons, I'd like to look at some of the monk weapons themselves. Now there are 25 of them total in the game, and it'll be pretty boring to just read through 25 different weapon stat blocks, so I've chosen 6 in total that I think have a particular draw to them. The first of this is the Gakung, which is a bow specifically for the monastic archer stance. There are 3 total monk bows in the game right now, in addition to the longbow and the short bow that the monastic archer stance also works with. But the Gakung in particular is very comparable to a longbow, having only one lower die size, so a d6 versus d8, and a deadly d8 versus the deadly d10 of the longbow. But in exchange, it makes up for it with no volley trait and still a very respectable 100-foot range, which is going to be cut down to 50 feet for the monastic archer restrictions. Next is the Temple Sword, which is the only non-advanced sword of the 3 monk swords available. So unless you want to jump through additional hoops on top of the P-file stance, this sword is the one you're going to be using. It's a D8 slashing sword that has the drip trait, so all in all not the most flashy of weapons, but it's certainly a reasonable weapon that gets the job done. Something to take note is that this sword is not finessable, so you do need to have strength for both your attack and damage stats on the sword. Next is the shuriken, which is obviously the weapon you're going to be using if you want to take the shooting star stance. It is an agile thrown weapon with a range of 20 feet that deals a T4 piercing damage. Now, this is unfortunately going to be a pretty poor choice in my opinion. Even a composite short bow has a range of 30 feet after the half from a monastic archer and deals more damage than the shuriken and has the deadly trait on top of it. So it's just really difficult to justify choosing the shuriken over the bows, especially when the bow archer monk has a much more robust feat support than the shuriken does. For the next three, we move into weapons which don't have a specific stance associated with them, but I think are interesting for other reasons. Starting with the bow staff, and I call this one out because there is a specific archetype, the staff acrobat archetype, which I talked about a little bit in my shove athletics video if you want some more information. But suffice to say, it's an archetype focused specifically around making good use of staves and specifically using them to control your opponent's movements with shoving and trips. Next we have the Fighting Fan, which is a one-handed T4 slashing weapon with agile, backstabber, deadly D6, and finesse. This I chose because there is a surprisingly low number of monk weapons with the finesse trait. Of the 25 total monk weapons, only 10 of them have finesse. A couple of them are advanced and a couple of them are two-handed. So the number of martial one-handed finesse weapons is surprisingly low. And the Fighting Fan is the one of those options that I personally like the best. D4 is not a great damage die, but Backstabber and Deadly D6 do go some way to alleviating that, and Agile on top of that works very well with your innate flurry of blows feature. And the final weapon I want to cover is the tonfa. This is another D4 weapon with Agile, Finesse, Parry, and Twin. And this one I want to cover specifically because of the combination of Agile and Twin on top of a monk weapon. Because monks very easily get 2 attacks on their turn with flurry of blows. Agile, which decreases the multiple attack penalty of those attacks, and Twin, which will increase the damage of the second attack, combines very well in a good synergistic package with what Monk wants to be doing anyways. So now, as always, I'd like to cover a little bit on what I would choose if I were making a weapon-focused monk instead of the standard unarmed striker. And for me personally, I like the monastic archer stance the best. Not only does it give a very different flavor of monk, because all the other monks require unarmed attacks and thus are locked into melee range, but also it is the weapon category with the most support in the monk feats. The other weapons rely on the normal monk feats to really be effective, and while you can certainly do that, it's often, at least in my opinion, just going to be easier and better to get a normal unarmed attack from one of the monk stances and do that instead of trying to jump through the hoops of using a monk weapon. With monastic archer stance, we get a very different flavor of monk, a sort of ranged skirmisher who runs around at a respectable distance, kind of at medium range, peppering their opponents with arrows and keeping well out of danger. With the Kaku, even with the half-range increment requirement from monastic archer stance, you still have a very respectable 50-foot range increment and a 1d6 piercing attack that you can deliver from that range. And if you're okay with working around the volley trait, which as a monk you probably have the move speed to at least attempt, the composite longbow giving and other additional damage dice to 1d8 piercing is very solid and reasonable damage from a much longer range that monks can normally be effective at. The other major consideration is going to be what are you going to do with all your extra actions? Your flurry of blows lets you attack twice for one action, and that leaves you two extra actions in which you really want to find something better to do than attack two more times at map -10. You can spend one action moving around to reposition to get yourself within that perfect sweet spot range for the composite longbow, but you still have one extra action. And with this action, I would personally lean into things like charisma skills, so using Modmo, using intimidation, that sort of idea, to apply debuffs to your opponent even at range, and assist both yourself and your allies in being able to defeat your enemies. So that's all for this week's video. I think that while monk weapons are really cool and it's very fun to have a monk that uses something other than their fists to deal damage, they are sort of unfortunately lacking in system support right now. So hopefully at some point Paizo comes back to them, maybe the remaster coming out later this year, to take a second pass and really make them at least somewhat viable in comparison to all the unarmed options. But that is all for this week's video, so I hope you enjoyed watching and I hope that you'll come back next time to see what I create. But most importantly, I hope you have a lovely day.